Your bedroom apple tree. Without no pants on. Stop that shine way up above. Without no pants on. People like oh, where you low. Without no pants on. Now you rude. This line with me. Without no pants on. Keep an arrow beat.
I was just thinking about the time that I went to France with Rita Franklin. I joined Rita Franklin band, and '69 I think, and I went to France, and I was rehearsing with the big band. I was playing baritone with Rita Franklin over there, and I was doing My Way. And as I would during the rehearsal, they had a lot of people in the audience sitting around listening to the rehearsal. So when I got off the bandstand, a guy walked up to me and he said to me, he said, "Hey, you from New Orleans?" I said, "Oh, no, man. I said, I'm from Detroit," because I was with Rita Franklin. He said, No, you from New Orleans because it's in your plane." I said, "Yes." I said, "My name is Charlie Gabriel." He said, "Well, do you know Manny Gabriel?" I said, "Manny Gabriel?" I said, "It's my daddy." He said, "Yeah." So I started talking with him, and I found out he was a jazz critic, and he knew he had met Sidney Bechet, and he knew all about Sidney Bechet. And Sidney Bechet was one of the first pioneers that left New Orleans back in the 20s to go to France, and he was well known in France. And he worked with my grandfather, jazz band, national jazz band. So he got to be liking me, and he took me all around Nice, France, and showed me a big statue of Sidney Bechet. So I came home, I told my dad, I said, "Hey, Dad," I said, "You know, you guys known all the way over in France." They said, "I met a guy, he asked me, did I know Manny Gabriel?" He said, "Man, he was talking about me. He was talking about my daddy because they call me Little Man." So I didn't know as much about myself as I thought I did. And I found out the man knew all about my people. So that's in '69. So I had to start talking to all my older ones that were still living, like my Aunt Cecile, my Uncle Clarence, my Aunt Alberta, my Uncle August. And I went on back and started to find out who I was and what I was. That's when I found out, I traced my family back to my great-great-grandfather, Narcisse Gabriel, from Singer Dominguez from the Dublin Republican Island, and who he's married, and so forth and so forth. And now I'm very happy to know that I'm a part of some of the original musicians that started the rock for jazz for this university, and I'm pleased to be here and continue this tradition of jazz, and this is what I'm doing today.
When Narcisse Gabriel and his brother Joseph moved to New Orleans from the Dominican Republic in the late 1850s, they brought their families into one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities. Situated on the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Mississippi River, New Orleans was a major trade center. African, French, Spanish, and American cultures mingled. In a town that loved music, Congo Square kept traditional African rhythms alive. Marching bands played in the streets. String bands played European folk music. And this new sound, called the blues, had solo pianists working through the night at pleasure houses. Narcisse Gabriel instilled a family infatuation with music making that lives over a century, 6 generations later. His daughters, Mary, Alice, and Cecilia, played guitar and sang. His son, Martin Joseph Gabriel, played accordion and led bands that played in the French Quarter and at estates on Lake Pontchartrain at the turn of the century. When the brassy sounds of jazz sifted in, Martin Joseph picked up cornet and trumpet. His national orchestra was one that a few later jazz greats came through during their formative years.
I remember Adolph White. He was a trombone player, played with my daddy. A little fellow played bass we used to call butt cut. And Barberin, Adolph Barberin, which is Paul Barberin's daddy, he played along in the brass band and the jazz band with my daddy. And
some of your brothers played with you,
well, yeah, they come along later. My brother Manny, he played drums with my daddy. I don't remember if Clarence played with my daddy, but now my sister Alberta, she played piano, and she used to copy most of the music or write the music for my daddy. That was my oldest sister. Then there was old Lloyd Keppert, played with him. Johnny Sincere, also. The first band that the late great Johnny Sincere ever played with. My daddy started him out on guitar, and later he went from my daddy to playing with a couple of musicians around New Orleans right into the Louis Armstrong's Hot Five. He got just that good, and he was well known all over. In later years, he was out there in Disneyland, played out there in Disneyland with quite a few of the musicians from out of New Orleans.
So what kind of impression did this make on you when you were a young kid and saw your father's got a band and your brothers and sisters were playing? And I mean, obviously there was a lot of music going on.
Well, it was a lot of fun around the house. Back then, every Sunday and Saturday, and even some nights during the week, there were always a lot of people coming to the house. And my brother Clarence got on the piano. I had another cousin, Ernest. He got to kazoot. Or somebody would be beating on something for the drums. And we just had a lot of fun. We'd all be around there singing and dancing, and some of the neighbors would drop in. And then when my daddy had rehearsal with the band, it was always at my house.
Playing and learning together as a family was a pattern to be repeated again.
I first started playing music, I was about 11 years old. My dad heard my cousin Clarence Ford and myself fooling around with a potato whistle. It was made like a potato. And we were blowing this potato whistle. Clarence had the potato whistle, and we were doing duets on the potato whistle. And my dad heard us playing this potato whistle on the back step. We were living on Conti Street, 2219 Conti. And he told my mother, those boys are going to play some music. So when he go to work, he was working with the WPA band. My dad was the WPA band. When he go to work, I used to, Clarence and I went inside and were fooling around with the clarinet and took the clarinet out in the backyard, and we were trying to play on it. And he came and he caught us playing on the clarinet. And usually my dad, if he catch you playing with his horn, you automatically got a whipping. I mean, a good whipping. So instead of him whipping us, he told us, come on, let me show you something about this horn. So he started teaching Clarence and myself how to play the clarinet. We were playing the C clarinet first, because at first he had 2 E flat, but we started playing on the C clarinet. And we would practice and practice 8-9 hours a day. And we practiced so much and made so many bad notes things that they put us in the yard in our birder house. And then we had what you call a chicken coop. And Clarence and I was sitting in this chicken coop, and we would play, and the chicken would be on the top of us, and the chicken would sometimes doo-doo on our paper.
And again, over the years,
I have always been very musically aware. Even as a young child, I was very attuned to music. I used to play the piano as a baby, just banging, of course, like many children do, but I had a fascination with the piano. As I became older, I knew my grandfather was very involved in music. Some of my uncles I was aware of were very involved in music. And my own dad was a bass player and songwriter. And so my dad is Joe Gabriel. And Dad wanted me to take piano lessons. We didn't have a piano, but I started taking piano lessons anyway at about almost 6 years old. And my grandfather had a very small white piano, which we still have in the family, at his home, and I would go over and learn how to practice on this miniature baby grand piano. Sometime later, my father bought a Wurlitzer, and I continued taking lessons for about 7 or 8 years, mostly classical music. My grandfather was one of the persons who stayed on my back about practicing. Of course, my own dad stayed on me to practice constantly, and how important it was to learn to read the music. It was very important that I knew how to read the music. Big Daddy would try to teach me some of the things from New Orleans, so he exposed me to some band music. I had no concept of band music. It was very, very difficult for me to understand how the piano played one part and the other instruments played their parts. I found it very difficult. However, as time passed, he insisted that I learned it, so I would learn gradually. Now, Uncle Charles, who was my godfather, was traveling all through the country most of my childhood. As he would come home to visit, he would keep up on my progress, and all of my uncles would surround me. They put music up, and then they watched me read the notes. And if I didn't get a note right, I knew I was in trouble, so I really made sure I was reading the music. Because if I didn't read it, they knew I wasn't reading it. I was like having this major test. They stayed on me, and Uncle Charles had in the back of his mind that as soon as I got old enough, I'd start playing music with him.
What are some of the earliest songs you remember hearing around the house?
One, I wish I could shimmy like my sister Kate. That was one of them. Dogtown Strutter's Ball. One number I remember, I used to love to hear my daddy play, Girl of My Dreams. That was a waltz. Later, they had a habit of playing, they'd take a waltz, and they'd play about 2 or 3 choruses of it in a waltz tempo. Because then, if you couldn't play a waltz, you wouldn't get no jobs.
Oh, waltzes were the main dancing music?
Yes, all these, well, that's when the men could show off their stuff with the ladies, you know, make spin around and dance on their toes. They used to have waltz contests back then. They put chalk on your heels. Now you had to dance on your toes, and if your heel touched the floor while you was doing that waltz, you was eliminated. That's the way it was. And then after they'd play a few choruses of that waltz, then they'd pick up the tempo and put it in a foxtrot. And there was another dance back then they did. Only time you'd see it, I think I heard them mention it on television a couple of weeks ago, was the quadrille.
Oh, that's one of those French dances.
Yes. And he was one of the few bands back then that could play a quadrille.
Quadrilles were probably something that people were starting to not play anymore.
At least 4 to 8 people doing that. You see them in the movies nowadays, some of these societies, they dance around and dip under one another's arm. But one of those, they had special music for that. And there was another dance type of music you had to play, was called the shotters.
What's that?
That's one of those old dances like the quadrille back in there. As the society of the better class of people, doctors and lawyers, well, they'd have that at their fair. These millionaires now, the everyday people, they didn't bother with doing that. Those were all foreign dances that come from over the other countries.
Percy's brother-in-law, Auguste Lenoir, specialized in quadrilles, chants de chant, and waltzes as an activist for the preservation of Creole culture. He played in string bands and ragtime orchestras, the music which immediately predated jazz.
What's the New Orleans jazz sound that's different from other kinds of jazz?
Well, a lot of people try to compare New Orleans jazz with Dixieland. It's not. New Orleans jazz is played with the feeling. You play your main theme. You keep your melody at all times so that people know you play your solos and counterpoint to your melody. And people know what you're playing at all times, regardless of how much you jazz it up. And it's played more that everybody can feel it. It's not played too fast. And it's played with a solid beat. Mm-hmm. You cannot sit there and listen to it and don't pat your hand or pat your feet. You're going to move some kind of way.